Today we're going to tackle some difficult things, and I think it's good for us to get into some scriptures once in a while that are very sensitive to us, very difficult for us to understand, because when we do that, we grow in our faith even more than when we just read a passage that is glaringly obvious to us. And so we're going to pick up in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. Now, this is kind of the front end to about 4 more verses that we really need to look at too, and we will maybe in our next session. But we're going to look at these 2 right here in very close vision so that we can take as much from them as we can. He says that Christ suffered in the flesh, and so we better be prepared to do the same thing. He says, arm yourselves also with the same purpose. We're going to suffer in the flesh, and that's normal. As a Christian who is really living it out is going to suffer in the flesh. Now, that doesn't mean your flesh will always suffer. It means it might be psychologically. It might be obviously in how you're treated by others, how you are accepted or not accepted by others. These are all persecutions of the flesh because we live in these 5 senses as spiritual beings living in a human body. And it's very important that we understand that suffering in the flesh isn't always being beat up and martyred and tortured and whipped and kicked and stabbed and shot. That's not what it always is. But because we have these 5 senses, we may hear things that are very, very detrimental to us, feeling right about ourselves sometimes. And we know the truth because the truth is in Jesus Christ, and that's how we get over that stuff. Now, all of us growing up usually don't live very fruitful, productive Christian lives. We usually get caught up in the youthful desires and lust of the flesh and doing the things of the culture and the society that make us hip or help us feel good, like we're accepted. And sometimes that requires us to obviously sin. It's not good. We do it sometimes. There are a few people that ignore that and walk through it, but most people give in. And then they come to a place where they meet Christ, and they realize that Christ suffered and died and was raised from the dead for them as an individual. And so we can be prepared to obviously suffer some in our mortal journey too, and we will, and we all do. Most of us don't think of some of it as suffering because our bodies aren't hurt or injured. And sometimes, especially if you go into other countries, their bodies are hurt and injured. But we're talking about where we're at today. And we have to realize that we've been through the lust. We've been through the desires of the world. We've lived like that. We don't need to any longer. And as he says there in verse 2, he says, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer for the lust of men, but for the will of God. In other words, we come to a place in our spiritual journey with Christ where we start really living the will of God out. And that's an important place to come. Unfortunately, some Christians continue to live in the flesh and don't put away those things which hinder them from having a relationship with God. Now, even the best of us, as we live our lives for Christ Jesus, we're going to trip and fall once in a while. But His forgiveness is there, and we can get up and go on. We don't have to lay down in the dirt and feel like we've been conquered by the enemy. We can get up and keep walking with Christ. We all trip once in a while. Hopefully we trip less and less as we walk more and more with Jesus. And that is how we can live these 2 verses out.